The flickering candle cast a lonely glow across Madeline Evans' tear-stained face as she sat motionless at the rough-hewn table, her wedding dress billowing around her like a deflated dream. The flame wavered, threatening to extinguish itself much like her hopes for the future had done earlier that day when the stagecoach carrying her would-be husband never arrived. Montana Territory, 1878. Madeline had traveled from Boston to the frontier town of Pinewood Creek on the promise of marriage to a man she'd corresponded with for nearly a year. Edmund Porter, a store owner who had painted such vivid pictures of their life together in his letters that she'd packed her belongings, bid farewell to her disapproving parents, and journeyed west with nothing but hope in her heart. Now, as night descended over the small cabin Edmund had prepared for their life together, Madeline found herself utterly alone. No husband, no explanation. Just a note from the town sheriff explaining that Edmund had been found dead 3 days prior, victim of a robbery gone wrong on his way to collect her from the stagecoach station. The wedding dress she'd sewn herself now felt like a prison of silk and lace. Her eyes burned from crying, but no more tears would come. The candle, the only source of light in the cabin since she hadn't mastered lighting the oil lamps, was burning dangerously low. A sudden knock at the door startled her. Madeline stiffened, clutching the table edge. Who would call at this hour? Few even knew she was here. "Hello," a deep voice called from outside. "Is anyone home?" Madeline remained silent, fear creeping up her spine. "I saw the candlelight," the voice continued. "If you're in there, I mean no harm. I'm just passing through and got caught in this weather. Was hoping for a place to wait out the storm." Only then did Madeline register the pattering of rain against the cabin roof, which had begun sometime during her grief-stricken haze. She rose slowly, moving toward the door with cautious steps. "Who are you?" she called, her voice hoarse from crying. "Name's Thomas Calloway, madam. I'm just a cowboy looking for shelter from the rain. I can pay for the trouble." Madeline hesitated, her hand on the latch. Edmund had spoken of dangerous men who roamed these territories. But he had also spoken of the code of the West hospitality, even to strangers. With trembling fingers, she lifted the bar and opened the door just enough to peer out. Rain slashed down in silver sheets, illuminated by a flash of lightning that revealed the tall figure of a man. He stood respectfully back from the threshold, water dripping from the brim of his hat. When lightning flashed again, she caught a glimpse of his face weathered by sun and wind, with honest eyes that held no malice. "You're alone?" she asked, suspicion evident in her voice. "Yes, madam. Just me and my horse. He's tied up under your lean-to, hope you don't mind. Weather came on sudden like." Another gust of wind drove rain against the cabin, and the candle behind Madeline guttered precariously. Making a quick decision, she stepped back. "You can come in, but just until the storm passes." The man called Thomas ducked through the doorway, removing his hat as he entered. Water pooled around his boots on the wooden floor. In the dim light, Madeline could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair, and a face that, while sun-hardened, possessed a certain gentleness. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her appearance, the white dress, the carefully arranged hair now falling loose around her shoulders. "I'm interrupting something," he said, backing toward the door. "I apologize, madam." "No," Madeline said quickly, surprised at her own response. "There's nothing to interrupt anymore." Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned away, embarrassed by her show of emotion. Behind her, she heard the man's cautious footsteps as he moved further into the cabin. "Your candle's about to go out," he observed quietly. Madeline looked at the dying flame. "I haven't figured out how to light the lamps yet," she admitted, feeling foolish. "I only just arrived in town today." Thomas set his hat on a hook by the door and removed his drenched coat. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the oil lamp hanging from a beam. At Madeline's nod, he moved with practiced efficiency, taking the lamp down and checking its reservoir. "It's got oil," he said. "Do you have matches?" Madeline indicated a small box on the mantel. Thomas struck a match and carefully removed the lamp's glass chimney. Just as Madeline's candle sputtered its final breath, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness, he touched the match to the lamp's wick. Golden light bloomed, pushing back the shadows. "There," he said, replacing the chimney and hanging the lamp back in its place. The cabin was suddenly bathed in a warm glow that revealed details previously hidden in darkness: the neatly made bed in the corner, trunk still packed against the wall, a table set for two. Thomas's eyes lingered on the table's settings before moving back to Madeline's face. Understanding dawned in his expression. "You were expecting someone," he said softly. "My fiancé," Madeline replied, her voice barely audible above the rain. "We were to be married today." Thomas removed his hat again, holding it respectfully against his chest. "I'm sorry to hear that, madam." Did something delay him? A bitter laugh escaped Madeline's lips. "Death delayed him, Mr. Callaway, permanently." Shock registered on Thomas's face, followed by genuine sympathy. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Miss Evans, Madeline Evans." She sank back into her chair at the table, suddenly too weary to maintain formalities. "And now I find myself a bride with no groom, alone in a strange town where I know no one, with no means to return home even if I wanted to." Thomas remained standing, clearly uncertain of how to respond to such raw honesty from a stranger. Outside, thunder rumbled and the rain intensified. "Have you eaten?" he asked finally. The unexpected question pulled Madeline from her thoughts. "What food, Miss Evans? Have you had any today?" Madeline tried to remember. Had she eaten? The day had become a blur of shock and grief after the sheriff delivered his news. "I don't believe I have," she admitted. Thomas nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "If you'll permit me, I have some jerky and biscuits in my saddlebag." "Not much of a meal, but it'll do until morning." Without waiting for her response, he returned to the door and stepped briefly into the rain, returning moments later with a worn leather bag. From it, he produced a cloth-wrapped package. "It's not fancy," he said, unwrapping dried meat and slightly crushed biscuits, "but it's good for traveling." He placed the food on the table, then hesitated. "Do you have coffee? I could make some if you'd like." The simple offer of food and coffee, such ordinary things, somehow broke through Madeline's numbness. A fresh wave of tears threatened, but she blinked them back. "The coffee should be in one of those crates," she said, pointing to a stack near the small stove. "Edmund sent word that he'd stocked the cabin for my arrival." Thomas efficiently located the coffee, found a pot, and set about preparing it. His movements were sure and practiced, a man accustomed to making do in rustic circumstances. As he worked, Madeline found herself studying him. He wasn't what she would have called handsome in Boston society, but there was something appealing about his weathered features and the quiet competence with which he moved. "What brings you to Pinewood Creek, Mr. Callaway?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Just passing through," he replied, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "I'm driving some cattle up to the railroad at Fort Benton. Stopped in town for supplies, then got caught in this weather on my way back to the herd. My men are camped about 5 miles east. You're the trail boss, then?" Thomas glanced at her with slight surprise. "Yes, madam. Not many Eastern ladies know much about cattle drives. I've read dime novels," Madeline admitted with a faint smile. "Though I suspect the reality is far less romantic than those stories suggest." "About as romantic as mud, dust, and the smell of 1,000 cattle," Thomas confirmed, but there was humor in his voice. He placed the coffee pot on the stove and stoked the fire that had been smoldering low. The simple domestic activity, so ordinary and yet so comforting, eased something in Madeline's chest. For the first time since learning of Edmund's death, she felt as though she could breathe properly. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Callaway," she said softly. Thomas looked up from the stove, his expression sincere. "Out here, folks help each other, Miss Evans. It's the way of things." The coffee began to bubble, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Thomas poured 2 cups and brought them to the table, sitting across from Madeline only after she gestured for him to do so. "What will you do now?" he asked after a moment of silence. Madeline stared into her coffee cup. "I don't know. I have some money saved, but not enough for passage back east. And even if I could return." She trailed off, remembering her parents' disapproval, their warnings about frontier life and marrying a man she knew only through letters. No going back, Thomas guessed. Not really, no. She took a sip of coffee, finding comfort in its warmth. "I'll need to find work here, I suppose," Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Pinewood Creek's growing. The widow Simmons runs the boarding house. She might need help, or the school's looking for a teacher from what I heard in town." "I was a teacher in Boston," Madeline said, surprised. "I taught at a girls' academy for 3 years before deciding to marry a stranger and move west." Thomas finished when she hesitated. Madeline looked up sharply, expecting judgment, but found only gentle understanding in his eyes. "It sounds foolish when you put it that way," she admitted. "Not foolish," Thomas countered. "Brave. It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind for a chance at something better." His words touched something deep inside her. Brave. No one had described her decision that way before. Her parents had called it reckless, her friends, romantic folly. But brave. That was a new perspective. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the storm outside gradually lessening to a steady rain. Madeline found herself surprisingly hungry once she started eating, and Thomas seemed content to sit quietly across from her, occasionally adding more wood to the stove to keep the coffee hot. "Tell me about your cattle drive, Mr. Callaway," she said eventually, wanting to focus on something other than her own troubles. Thomas looked surprised at her interest, but began describing his work, the challenges of moving a herd across the Montana territory, the men who worked for him, the markets they were trying to reach. Madeline listened, finding herself genuinely interested in this world so different from her own. "You know a great deal about business for a cowboy," she observed when he explained his pricing strategies. Thomas smiled ruefully. "I wasn't always a cowboy. My father was a banker in St. Louis. He wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but I had different ideas." "Another rebel against parental expectations," Madeline said with a small smile. "We have that in common, it seems." "Seems so," he agreed. "Though my father eventually made his peace with my choices. Before he died last year, he even admitted I might have been right to follow my own path." "You're fortunate. I doubt my parents will ever understand why I came west." "They might surprise you," Thomas said. "Time has a way of changing perspectives." The conversation flowed easily between them as the night deepened. Thomas proved to be both educated and thoughtful, challenging Madeline's preconceptions of frontier men. When he spoke of books he'd read or his thoughts on the changing West, she found herself responding with her own opinions, engaging in a level of intellectual discourse she had feared she might never find again after leaving Boston. Hours passed, and only when Madeline stifled a yawn did they both realize how late it had grown. The rain had stopped, and moonlight now filtered through the cabin's small windows. "I've kept you up far too late," Thomas said, rising from the table. "I should go. My men will be wondering what became of me. At this hour." "Surely you don't intend to ride in the dark," Madeline said, surprising herself with her concern. Thomas hesitated. "It wouldn't be proper for me to stay, Miss Evans, you being alone and all." Madeline considered this. He was right, of course. Her reputation would be compromised if anyone knew she'd spent the night alone with a strange man, and yet the thought of returning to solitude after these hours of connection filled her with dread. "The storm could return," she said finally. "And the ground will be muddy and treacherous. It would be foolish to risk injury when there's a perfectly good floor here." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're certain, I'll be gone at first light." "I'm certain," Madeline said, more confidently than she felt. She found a blanket in one of the trunks and offered it to him. Thomas arranged himself on the floor near the stove, insisting it was far more comfortable than many places he'd slept during cattle drives. Madeline retreated behind a screen to change out of her wedding dress and into a nightgown, then slipped into the bed, acutely aware of the man's presence across the room. "Good night, Mr. Callaway," she called softly. "Good night, Miss Evans," came his reply from the darkness. "And thank you for your hospitality." Madeline lay awake for some time, listening to the gentle rhythm of Thomas's breathing and pondering the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago, she had been filled with anticipation for her wedding day. Now her fiancé was dead, and she was sharing her cabin with a cowboy she'd just met. Yet somehow she didn't feel afraid. Instead, for the first time since learning of Edmund's death, she felt a small spark of hope that perhaps her journey west hadn't been in vain after all. When Madeline awoke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the cabin was empty. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed the entire encounter with Thomas Calloway. Then she noticed the coffee pot sitting on the stove, still warm, and a note propped against it. Rising quickly, she crossed the room and picked up the folded paper. "Miss Evans," it read in surprisingly neat handwriting, "thank you for your kindness. I've taken the liberty of bringing in more firewood and filling your water bucket. The coffee is fresh. I'll check on you before leaving town today. Respectfully, Thomas Calloway." Madeline smiled despite herself. Such simple gestures, and yet they touched her deeply. She poured herself coffee and looked around the cabin with fresh eyes. In daylight, it was actually quite charming, sturdily built, with careful attention to details like the carved mantelpiece and polished floor. Edmund had prepared a good home for their life together. Edmund. The thought of him brought a pang of grief, but somehow less sharp than yesterday. She had barely known him, really just his letters, his words, his promises. She had been in love with the idea of him, perhaps more than the man himself. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Thomas standing there, hat in hand, his horse saddled and waiting nearby. "Good morning, Miss Evans," he said. "I hope I didn't wake you earlier when I left." "Not at all," she assured him. "Thank you for the coffee and the firewood," Thomas nodded, seeming slightly uncomfortable in the bright light of day. "I wanted to check if there's anything else you need before I head back to my herd." Madeline hesitated. There were so many things she needed: guidance, friendship, reassurance that she hadn't made a terrible mistake in coming west. But those weren't things she could ask of this near stranger, no matter how kind he had been. "I'll be fine," she said, straightening her shoulders. "The sheriff mentioned that Edmund's solicitor would call on me today to discuss my situation." "That's good," Thomas said, though he looked troubled. "Miss Evans, if I may, frontier towns can be difficult places for a woman alone. Be careful who you trust." "I will," she promised. "And thank you again for your help last night." Thomas shifted his weight, clearly preparing to leave, then paused. "I'll be back through Pinewood Creek in about 3 weeks after we deliver the herd. Would it be presumptuous to call on you then? Just to see how you're faring?" The offer surprised Madeline, sending an unexpected flutter through her chest. "I would welcome that, Mr. Callaway." His smile transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and brightening his eyes. "Until then, Miss Evans." With a tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Madeline watching from the doorway, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within her. The following days passed in a blur of practicalities. Edmund's solicitor, a kindly older man named Mr. Garrison, explained that Edmund had left everything to Madeline in a will he'd updated just before leaving to meet her stagecoach. The general store, the cabin, and a modest sum of money were now hers. "He was quite taken with you, even just through your letters," Mr. Garrison told her. "Said you had a good head for business and would know what to do with the store if anything happened to him." Madeline was overwhelmed by this unexpected responsibility, but also touched by Edmund's faith in her. With no better options and a determination to make her own way, she decided to keep the store and run it herself. The townspeople of Pinewood Creek watched with curiosity as she took over Edmund's business. Some were skeptical of a woman shopkeeper. Others were simply intrigued by the Eastern lady who had come to marry a man now dead. Madeline ignored the gossip and focused on learning everything she could about the store and its operations. Mrs. Simmons, the widow who ran the boarding house, proved to be an unexpected ally. She took Madeline under her wing, introducing her to other respectable women in town and helping her navigate the social complexities of frontier life. "You're causing quite a stir, my dear," Mrs. Simmons told her over tea one afternoon, 2 weeks after Madeline's arrival. A handsome young widow with her own business, the eligible men of Pinewood Creek can hardly contain their interest. "I'm not a widow," Madeline corrected. "Edmund and I never married. Details," Mrs. Simmons said with a wave of her hand. "The point is, you won't lack for suitors when you're ready." Madeline thought of Thomas Calloway and his promise to check on her when he returned. "I'm not sure I'll ever be ready," she said. "I came west to marry Edmund. Now that he's gone, well, I need to focus on making my own way." Mrs. Simmons studied her with shrewd eyes. "There's more than one path to happiness, Madeline. Don't close doors before you've even looked to see what's behind them." The advice lingered in Madeline's mind as she settled into her new life. The store kept her busy from dawn until dusk, and she gradually began making changes, reorganizing merchandise, adding items that might appeal to the women of the town, keeping more careful accounts than Edmund had done. To her surprise, she found she had a talent for business. The store began to prosper under her management, and with prosperity came a growing confidence in her own abilities. For the first time in her life, Madeline was truly independent, answering to no one but herself. Yet in quiet moments, usually late at night when she sat alone in her cabin, she found herself thinking of Thomas Calloway. Their single evening of conversation had affected her more deeply than she cared to admit. There had been something about his quiet strength, his thoughtfulness, his respect for her situation that had touched her heart, but it was foolish to dwell on such thoughts. He was a cowboy, constantly on the move. She was trying to build a stable life for herself. Their worlds might have briefly intersected, but they were ultimately traveling different paths. Or so she told herself, until exactly 3 weeks after their first meeting, when the bell above the store door jingled and Thomas Calloway walked in, looking as surprised to see her behind the counter as she was to see him in her store. "Miss Evans," he said, removing his hat. "I didn't expect to find you here, Mr. Callaway," she replied, heat rising inexplicably to her cheeks. "It seems I've become a shopkeeper since we last met." Thomas looked around at the neatly arranged store with obvious approval. "So I see, Edmund's place, isn't it?" "It was," Madeline confirmed. "Now it's mine." She explained about the will and her decision to take over the business. Thomas listened attentively, his eyes never leaving her face. "That's quite remarkable," he said when she'd finished. "Most women in your situation might have sold everything and returned east." "I considered it," Madeline admitted, "but something about that felt like defeat, as if all the courage it took to come west would have been wasted." "Not wasted," Thomas said softly, "just redirected." "But I understand what you mean." There was a moment of silence between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Madeline broke it first. "Did your cattle drive go well?" "Well enough," Thomas replied. "Got a fair price at Fort Benton, no major mishaps along the way, I can't complain." "And now you're headed back to—" Madeline realized she didn't know where he called home. "My ranch," Thomas supplied. "It's about 60 miles south of here. Nothing grand, but it's growing. I run cattle mostly with a few horses." "You have your own ranch?" Madeline couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Somehow she'd imagined him as a perpetual wanderer. Thomas smiled slightly. "Did you think I lived in the saddle year-round? Even cowboys need a place to hang their hats, Miss Evans." Before she could respond, the door opened again, and other customers entered the store. With an apologetic glance, Madeline turned to assist them, while Thomas browsed the merchandise, occasionally adding items to a small pile on the counter. When the store emptied again, he approached with his selections: coffee, tobacco, ammunition, and several other necessities. "I meant what I said about calling on you," Thomas said as Madeline wrapped his purchases. If you're free this evening, I'd like to take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant to celebrate your new venture. Madeline hesitated only briefly. I'd like that very much, Mr. Calloway. Thomas, please, he said, if we're to be friends. Madeline, then, she replied, feeling as though some significant threshold had been crossed. That evening, dressed in her second-best gown, she couldn't bring herself to wear the blue silk she'd brought for her honeymoon. Madeline met Thomas at the Grand Hotel, a somewhat grandiose name for Pinewood Creek's modest two-story establishment. He was waiting in the lobby, wearing a clean shirt and jacket, his usually unruly hair combed neatly. "You look beautiful," he said simply when she approached. "Thank you," Madeline replied, suddenly shy. "You clean up quite well yourself." The hotel restaurant was the finest dining establishment in Pinewood Creek, which wasn't saying much, but the food was well prepared and the atmosphere pleasant. They were shown to a table by the window where they could see the town's main street bathed in the golden light of sunset. Conversation flowed easily between them, picking up where they had left off 3 weeks earlier. Thomas told her about his ranch, how he'd started with just a small parcel of land and gradually expanded over the past 5 years. "It was my father's investment that made it possible," he admitted. "For all our disagreements, he believed in me enough to back my venture. I was able to repay him before he died, which I'm grateful for." "He must have been proud of you," Madeline said. "I think he was, in his way," Thomas replied. "Though he never quite understood why I preferred open skies to bank vaults." "And do you," Madeline asked, "still prefer the open skies, I mean?" Thomas considered the question thoughtfully. "Most days, though lately I've found myself thinking it might be nice to spend more time under a roof." There was something in the way he looked at her as he said this that made Madeline's heart beat faster. She changed the subject to safer ground, telling him about her adjustments to frontier life and the challenges of running the store. "The supply orders are the most difficult part," she explained. "Judging what people will want months in advance, since deliveries are so infrequent." "You seem to have a good understanding of it already," Thomas observed. "The store looks better stocked and organized than I remember from my previous visits." "Edmund kept minimal records," Madeline said. "I'm trying to be more methodical." "A teacher's approach," Thomas said with a smile. "Speaking of teaching," Madeline said, "I've been offered the position at the school here starting this fall. I'm considering taking it while still running the store." "Both, that's ambitious." "I would hire help for the store during school hours," she explained. "Mrs. Simmons's niece is arriving next month and needs employment. It seems a good solution for us both." "You're putting down roots here," Thomas observed. Madeline nodded slowly. "I suppose I am. It wasn't my original intention, but Pinewood Creek is growing on me." "It's a good town," Thomas agreed. "Close enough to my ranch for regular visits." The implication hung in the air between them. Regular visits. For what purpose? Their eyes met across the table, and Madeline saw in Thomas's gaze the same questions that filled her own mind. Was this merely friendship developing between them, or something more? Was it too soon after Edmund's death to contemplate such things? What would people say? As if reading her thoughts, Thomas reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "I'm not rushing anything, Madeline. But I'd like to call on you properly when I'm in town, if that's agreeable to you." The warmth of his fingers against hers sent a flutter through her chest. "Yes," she said softly, "that would be agreeable." After dinner, Thomas walked Madeline back to her cabin. The night was clear, stars spangling the vast Montana sky above them. They walked slowly, neither seemingly in a hurry to end the evening. "How long will you be in town?" Madeline asked as they approached her door. "Just tonight," Thomas replied. "I need to get back to the ranch." "But I'll be returning in 2 weeks for the cattle auction. I hope to see you then." They had reached her door. Madeline turned to face him, suddenly aware of how tall he was, how the moonlight silvered the edges of his features. "I've enjoyed this evening," she said. "Thank you." "So have I," Thomas replied. He hesitated, then took her hand gently in his. Madeline, I know we've only just met and your circumstances are complicated, but I find myself thinking about you far more than is probably wise. The honest admission touched her deeply. I think about you too, she confessed, though I'm not sure what that means yet. Thomas smiled, relief evident in his expression. It means we have something worth exploring when you're ready. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss against her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned, respectful, and yet it sent a thrill through Madeline that took her by surprise. "Good night, Madeline," he said softly. "Good night, Thomas," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He waited until she was safely inside before turning to leave. Through the window, Madeline watched him walk away, her heart fuller than it had been in weeks. True to his word, Thomas returned for the cattle auction 2 weeks later. He called on Madeline several times during his stay, taking her for walks around the town, helping her with small repairs at the store, and once, riding with her to a nearby meadow where wildflowers carpeted the ground in a riot of color. With each visit, Madeline's feelings for him deepened. Thomas was unlike any man she had known in Boston, straightforward yet thoughtful, rugged yet gentle, passionate about his land and his work. When he spoke of his ranch, his eyes lit with a contagious enthusiasm that made Madeline eager to see this place that meant so much to him. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. At the end of his visit, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Thomas turned to her with an uncharacteristically nervous expression. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "My sister Caroline is coming from St. Louis to stay with me for a few months. She's bringing her children, my nephew and niece, since her husband is traveling abroad on business. I've realized my house is woefully unprepared for a lady's comfort, let alone children's." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I was hoping you might advise me on what's needed. Perhaps you might even consider visiting the ranch to see for yourself what improvements would be appropriate." Madeline understood immediately what he was offering: an opportunity to see his home, to meet his family, all within the bounds of propriety thanks to his sister's presence. "I would need someone to mind the store," she said thoughtfully. "Of course," Thomas agreed quickly. "And it would only be for a week or so. Caroline arrives in 3 weeks, so there's time to prepare if you're interested." The hopeful look in his eyes decided her. "Yes, I'm interested, very much so." The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like sunrise. "Really, you'll come?" "Yes," Madeline laughed, caught up in his enthusiasm. "Though I warn you, I know very little about ranches." "And I knew very little about general stores before meeting you," Thomas countered. "We seem to be expanding each other's horizons." 2 weeks later, with the store left in the capable hands of Mrs. Simmons's niece, Madeline found herself traveling south in Thomas's wagon. The journey would take 2 days, with an overnight stay at a way station along the route. Mrs. Simmons, ever mindful of propriety, had insisted on sending her teenage son along as a chaperone, condition both Madeline and Thomas had readily accepted. The Montana landscape unfolded before them in breathtaking panoramas, rolling hills giving way to dramatic buttes, forests opening to vast prairies where wildflowers nodded in the summer breeze. Thomas pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his cattle drives, while Madeline found herself increasingly enchanted by both the land and the man beside her. Late on the second day, they crested a hill, and Thomas reined in the horses. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. Callaway Ranch. Below them stretched a verdant valley, bisected by a silver ribbon of river. Near its center stood a cluster of buildings, a substantial log house, a barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, small dark shapes against the green grass. "It's beautiful," Madeline said sincerely. "It's home," Thomas replied simply. Then, with a gentle slap of the reins, he urged the horses forward down the slope toward the ranch. They were greeted at the house by Thomas's foreman, a weather-beaten man named Jenkins, who made no effort to hide his surprise at seeing a lady in the wagon. Thomas introduced Madeline with quiet dignity, explaining that she would be staying for a week to help prepare for Caroline's visit. The house itself was sturdy and well-built, but clearly a bachelor's domain. The furnishings were sparse but good quality, with signs of Thomas's banking family background in touches like the piano in one corner, and bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Yet there was an austere quality to the rooms, a lack of the small comforts that transformed a house into a home. "It's a blank canvas," Madeline observed diplomatically after Thomas had shown her around. Thomas laughed. "A polite way of saying it's barely civilized." "Not at all," Madeline protested. "It just needs a woman's touch. Some curtains, tablecloths, perhaps a few rugs." Over the next several days, Madeline threw herself into the task of making the ranch house more welcoming. She and Thomas rode into the nearest town for supplies, returning with fabric, dishware, and other necessities. Together, they worked to transform the austere rooms into comfortable living spaces. In the process, Madeline found herself growing ever more comfortable with Thomas. They fell into an easy rhythm together, her organizational skills complementing his practical knowledge. In the evenings, with young Billy Simmons safely tucked away in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands, they would sit on the porch and talk for hours, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their futures. "I never thought I'd find someone who understands both worlds," Thomas confessed one evening as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky. "Someone who appreciates books and ideas, but also understands the value of this life out here." "I never thought I'd find myself enjoying such a life," Madeline replied. "Boston seems very far away now and not just in distance." Thomas turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Are you happy here, Madeline? Truly?" She considered the question carefully. "I'm happier than I expected to be," she said honestly. "There's a freedom here that I never knew in Boston, a chance to define myself by my own choices rather than society's expectations." "And Pinewood Creek, is that becoming home for you?" Madeline heard the real question beneath his words. "Pinewood Creek has been good to me," she said slowly. "But I'm beginning to think that home might be less about a place and more about the people who share it with you." Thomas reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "I've been thinking the same thing myself." On her last evening at the ranch, Thomas took Madeline riding to a high point overlooking the valley. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, casting long shadows across the grassland. In the distance, the mountains stood purple against the flaming sky. "I wanted you to see this before you left," Thomas said as they dismounted. "It's my favorite view on the whole ranch." "It's magnificent," Madeline breathed, taking in the sweeping vista. They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the changing light. Then Thomas turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Madeline," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you came west with different expectations, but these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life." Madeline's heart quickened at the earnestness in his voice. "I'm not asking for promises yet," Thomas continued, "just permission to court you properly, to see if what's growing between us might become something lasting." The sincerity in his eyes touched Madeline deeply. Here was a man who understood loss and new beginnings, who had carved his own path just as she was carving hers. A man who saw her as she was, not as a fragile eastern flower or a convenient frontier bride, but as a partner. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." The smile that illuminated Thomas's face was worth every mile she had traveled, every tear she had shed, every moment of uncertainty since leaving Boston. Gently, he drew her closer, his eyes asking a question that Madeline answered by lifting her face to his. Their first kiss was tender and unhurried, a promise rather than a passion, and all the more meaningful for its restraint. When they parted, Madeline felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, as if the pieces of her life, so recently scattered, were finding a new and better arrangement. "We should head back," Thomas said softly, though he made no move to release her. "It'll be dark soon." Madeline nodded, but neither of them moved immediately. Instead, they stood together a moment longer, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue above, bearing witness to the beginning of something neither had expected but both now treasured. In the months that followed, Thomas courted Madeline with a thoughtfulness that would have impressed even Boston society. He made regular trips to Pinewood Creek, sometimes staying for just a day, other times for nearly a week. On each visit, he brought small gifts, wildflowers gathered along the trail, books he thought she might enjoy, once even a kitten from a litter born in his barn. Madeline found herself looking forward to his visits with increasing eagerness. When he was in town, the days seemed brighter somehow, filled with conversations that ranged from practical matters of business to philosophical discussions of books they'd both read. Thomas took a genuine interest in the store's operation and offered useful suggestions based on his own business experience. In turn, Madeline listened attentively to his plans for expanding the ranch, offering perspectives he might not have considered. When autumn came, Madeline began teaching at the school while continuing to oversee the store's operations. The dual roles kept her busy, but she found deep satisfaction in both. The children of Pinewood Creek were eager learners, and their parents appreciated having an educated teacher for the growing settlement. Thomas attended the Harvest Festival at the school, watching with evident pride as Madeline organized the children's performances. Afterward, as they walked back to her cabin in the crisp October evening, he spoke of his hopes for the future. "I've been thinking about adding onto the ranch house," he said. "A proper dining room, perhaps another bedroom or two, for Caroline's future visits." Madeline asked, though she suspected there was more to his plans. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly because I've been hoping, that is, I've been thinking about a more permanent arrangement, for us." Madeline's heart leapt, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of arrangement?" Taking her hands in his, Thomas looked into her eyes with an expression of such tender hope that Madeline felt tears threatening. "I love you, Madeline Evans," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since that first night when you sat alone with that dying candle, and I had the privilege of bringing light back into your home. I don't want to rush you, and I know it hasn't been that long since Edmond, but I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, not right away if you're not ready, but someday soon." Opening the box, he revealed a delicate ring with a small but brilliant diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to me before he died, saying it should go to the woman who captured my heart as completely as my mother captured his." Madeline looked from the ring to Thomas's face, seeing in his eyes all the love and commitment she had once dreamed of finding in the West. Not with a stranger whose words on paper had promised a new life, but with this man whose actions had shown her what true partnership could be. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "Not someday, Thomas, soon. I love you, and I don't want to wait to begin our life together." The joy that transformed Thomas's face was matched by the happiness swelling in Madeline's own heart as he slipped the ring onto her finger. His kiss was more confident now, filled with promise and shared dreams of the future they would build together. They were married in Pinewood Creek's small church just before Christmas, with snow falling gently outside and candles illuminating the simple space. Mrs. Simmons wept openly, while Mr. Garrison gave Madeline away with paternal pride. Thomas's sister Caroline had traveled from St. Louis with her children, who served as flower girl and ring bearer. After the ceremony, Thomas led Madeline outside to where his wagon waited, decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons. As he lifted her onto the seat, he paused, looking up at her with a smile that warmed her despite the winter chill. "Do you remember that night when we first met?" he asked. "You sitting alone with that candle about to go out?" Madeline nodded, the memory vivid in her mind. "How could I forget? It was the lowest moment of my life. And yet, looking back, it was the beginning of everything good," Thomas said, climbing up beside her. I've always believed that even the darkest moments can lead to unexpected light if we're brave enough to keep going. As they drove away from the church amid the cheers and well wishes of their friends, Madeline leaned against her new husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that her journey west had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Not to the life she had imagined when leaving Boston, but to something far better, a life built on genuine love, mutual respect, and the courage to begin again. The candle that had nearly gone out that stormy night had been relit, and in its steady flame, Madeline had found not just light, but warmth, hope, and a love that would illuminate all their days to come.